Hello, I'm Mike Couch speaking for Apologetics Press, and we're going to be talking about true science is the Christian's friend. This is a very important topic because we're often told that somehow there's a conflict between science and the Bible. But when we look at true science, we find that it is completely consistent with the Bible, and in many cases actually refutes false religions such as atheism. When we get into this topic, though, it's very important that we keep the goal in mind. I'm going to start out quoting from Ephesians chapter 4, verse 14 through 15, where it says, "As a result, we are no longer to be children, tossed here and there by waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in all aspects into Him as the head, even Christ." And that's important because first, we need to always be speaking the truth in love. A lot of times people look at us as Christians, and it's not just what we say, it's how we say it, how we approach the subject. And we need to show them that we truly care about their soul. It's a very important topic to us and that we are very concerned about their eternity. And the second point, though, is that we also have to be aware, as the Bible tells us, that we can be carried away by trickery of men, craftiness, and deceitful scheming. And so that's something that I will want to be keeping in mind throughout these DVDs as well. Also, talking about loving our neighbors, Mark 12, 29 through 31 says, "Jesus answered, 'The foremost is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these.'" And when we think about it, the best way that we can love our neighbor, the greatest way that we can love our neighbor is to encourage them to obey the gospel, to encourage them to come to the truth. We could give them any sum of money, any material possession, any position in life, anything like that we could possibly give them is nothing compared to encouraging them to obey the gospel, encouraging them to be able to spend eternity with God. And so when we talk about loving our neighbors as ourselves, this is also a very important topic in that it is just one way that we can do that. One way, again, that we can encourage them to consider the Bible with an open mind and then act accordingly. So, do want to talk about, is atheism scientific? Because that's what we're often told. And again, emphasize that the idea that the universe and everything in it simply made itself actually goes against everything we know about true science. True science is the Christian's friend and the enemy of the atheist. Now, God has given us tremendous evidence that we should put our faith in Him, but it's important to note that it's still our choice. In other words, we still get to choose. And when we're making that choice, Romans 1:20 comes to mind. "For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." And so we talk about choice. We talk about how we get to choose where we put our faith. And so that's the first topic that we're going to talk about today, is just this whole idea of how can we choose? And that sounds pretty simple. Most of us, when we're asked to make a choice, we don't even think about how am I actually be able to make that choice. But the very important point here is that if the atheists were right, if we didn't have a soul, if we didn't have a spirit, we would just be several thousand trillion atoms just chemically reacting. Again, nothing more than that, just purely physical. We actually could not make even a simple choice. Everything we did, just anything at all, getting a glass of water, getting a cup of coffee, walking, anything we chose to do would just be a result of chemical reactions. It would be at a fundamental level, just those atoms, those several thousand trillion atoms in our body just chemically reacting. We could not make even a simple choice. And so the fact that we know we can choose, God lets us make simple choices, but just the fact that we can choose at all proves God's existence. In other words, the fact that we can choose tells us how we should choose. You see the pictures, we have a nice picture of families in front of a campfire. The reason we use that is a nice picture, but it's also, if we did not have a spirit, if we were literally just a chemical reaction, then we would be nothing more than that log that's burning in a fire. And the reason that is that a log burning in a fire is actually a very sophisticated chemical reaction. In other words, how that log is going to burn, it depends on the type of wood, the temperature of the wood, the texture of the wood, the composition of the wood, the composition of the air blowing past the wood or in the vicinity of the wood, all kinds of factors. As a matter of fact, we can use our best computer programs, our best computational fluid dynamics programs. We can use our best laboratory equipment to analyze that log, look at things like the surface texture. All of our state-of-the-art technology, we cannot tell how that log is going to burn when we throw it on a fire. In other words, that log burning is such a sophisticated chemical reaction that we can't even predict how it's going to burn. But the question is, can the log choose where it's going to burn? In other words, a very sophisticated chemical reaction, so sophisticated we can't even predict how it's going to burn, but can it choose? Well, of course not. It's not. We know that the log isn't making a choice where it's going to burn. Very sophisticated chemical reaction. If that's all people were, we would be the same way. In other words, we would not be able to make a choice. We would just be a very sophisticated chemical reaction. And so when we're talking about people, about choosing where to put their faith, what are they, really, how are they leading their lives? Where are they putting their faith? This can actually be a very good conversation starter. Just simply say, do you have a choice? Sometimes people will say, we'll start a conversation, and they might say, I'm an atheist. Well, we can say, well, did you choose to be an atheist? And sometimes that'll catch them a little bit off guard. But the point is, they will typically say, well, yeah, I chose to be an atheist. And then we can use that to continue the conversation and say, well, if you chose to be an atheist, that proves you can't be an atheist. In other words, if we can make any choice at all, atheism is wrong because we are more than just a chemical reaction. We actually have a spirit. We actually have a soul. Now, this isn't just Christians that have noticed this. And so the next 3 slides, we're just going to give some examples. And these are quotes from atheists. I had a workshop back in 2013. It was called Moving Naturalism Forward. Many of the leading atheists were present at that particular workshop. And a representative quote from that workshop was originally attributed to Francis Crick. It says, "You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Who you are is nothing but a pack of neurons." And so it's interesting when you think of that quote. First of all, Francis Crick, tremendous scientific reputation. But is that a scientific quote? Of course not. It's just his particular religion. He's apparently, unfortunately, an atheist. And so by being an atheist, he's using his scientific credentials to try to push his particular religion. And so again, when we talk about trickery and craftiness and deceitful scheming, well, that starts to kind of, unfortunately, fall a little bit into that particular category because again, he has a reputation, but he's not speaking in his field. He's not speaking at all like a scientist. He's just speaking, again, from his particular religious perspective. Goes on, says, this view is the naturalism that the workshoppers and the Berkshires were trying to move forward. Naturalism is also called materialism, the view that only matter exists, or reductionism, the view that all life, from tables to daydreams, is ultimately reducible to pure physics, or determinism, the view that every phenomenon, including our own actions, is determined by a pre-existing cause, which was itself determined by another cause, and so on, back to the Big Bang. So that's a good description, but you notice, none of that, no free will. None of that involves a choice. It's just all different views of this, phenomena. If we really were just several thousand trillion atoms chemically reacting, what would be some of those implications? Next quote, or next part of this article said, Daniel Dennett took a different view. While it is true that materialism tells us a human being is nothing more than a moist robot, a phrase Dennett took from a Dilbert comic, we run a risk when we let this cat or robot out of the bag. If we repeatedly tell folks that their sense of free will or belief in objective morality is essentially an illusion, such knowledge has the potential to undermine civilization itself. Dennett believes. Civil order requires the general acceptance of personal responsibility, which is closely linked to the notion of free will. Better, said Dennett, if the public were told that for general purposes, the self and free will and objective morality do indeed exist, that colors and sound exist too, just not in the way they think. They exist in a special way, which is to say, ultimately, not at all. So again, going back to Ephesians 4:14 through 15, again, we're talking about trickery, and we're talking about craftiness, and we're talking about deceitful scheming. Well, think about that quote. He's basically saying, well, we have to kind of deceive people, or we have to, use some trickery or some craftiness because we don't want to tell them what we really think. We just want to, kind of, fuzz it out, and just so they'll maybe accept our religion, maybe they'll somehow accept atheism. And of course, you also see a certain level of arrogance involved also, because it's, they apparently at least feel that they're, in their minds, evolved enough to handle the truth, whereas the rest of us aren't. And so it's just a very, again, good idea of how the conversation is often couched, or what I'll say almost like what Christians might be up against. But it's also, just very important note to go back to fundamentally the first huge difference between Christianity and a false religion such as atheism is that as Christians, we know we have free will. We know God has given us the ability to choose. We don't claim to know how exactly he does that, but we know he has. It's all throughout the Bible. Atheists don't believe that they have that particular choice. They don't feel that they can actually make choices. So a few other topics, that are very, very important to talk about. First of all, is when we're making this choice, we need to stay focused on eternity. We talked about that a little bit, but a lot of times when we're talking to people, it's very easy for all of us to just get involved and wrapped up in our day-to-day routine. In other words, very easy to get up in the morning, have a very busy, very productive day, doing things that most people consider good things to be doing, and then late that night go to bed and get up next morning and repeat it. But our lives on earth are very short compared to eternity. One way to think about it is if we think of eternity, even though eternity is completely outside the dimension of time, if we think of eternity as an infinite number of years, then literally a very long life on earth, say 100 years for physical life, well, that's zero compared to eternity. In other words, because literally, mathematically, 100 is zero compared to infinity. And so when we're making these choices, we need to make sure that we're using kind of the proper criteria for the choice. In other words, when we're deciding how we want to live our lives, where we're going to put our faith, we need to stay focused on eternity. Matthew 16:26, for what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? Now, another point where this ties in is that we also know that eternity is completely outside the dimension of time. And this is one where many people, we remember young children often ask this question, but even adults ask this question. The question is basically, if in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, which is what we read in Genesis 1:1, well, then who made God? And it's actually a question that can be a stumbling block for many people, because they'll, if they haven't asked the question, if they hadn't heard the question, and if they just kind of get hit with that, if someone's trying to weaken their faith, or someone's trying to discourage their faith, it can be difficult to answer. It can just be a challenging question it's a challenging question to answer if you haven't thought about it ahead of time. And so many ways to answer that, but perhaps the best one is just going right to the Bible. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so when it talks about in the beginning, that means not only did God create the heavens and the earth, but God also created time. In other words, God created the dimension of time. Well, for God to create the dimension of time, he has to be outside of time. In other words, he could not create time if he was inside of time. And if we think about it, anything outside the dimension of time, by definition, could not have a beginning or an end. In other words, the words beginning, end, before, after, well, those only make sense with the dimension of time. Before time was created, it wouldn't make any sense at all. And so because God created time, and of course, the Bible tells us that God inhabits eternity. It talks about God being in eternity outside the dimension of time. It's very, very consistent biblically, but also answers that fundamental question. Because by definition, since God created time, he's outside of time. He could not have a beginning or an end. And this can also be important because many times people will say, well, why do you believe the Bible? Why don't you believe all these, one of these other religions? Well, very few religions, if any, outside of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, address that particular issue about, again, how was God created, or who created God? And so again, it's a very important way to start narrowing people's focus, letting them know why we're Christians, why we believe what we do believe. Now, The other questions that we can ask, so we've already mentioned that the fact that we can choose where we put our faith tells us how we should choose when we're putting our faith. We know that we need to focus on eternity. We know that the Bible answers many of these fundamental questions asked. We just talked again about how God, by definition, could not have had a beginning. Well, then we can start moving into what people might consider more scientific questions. And so, a first question when we talk about, well, could the universe and everything in it have simply made itself? Well, a good initial question to ask is, well, is it scientific to think that life could just make itself? And we'll cover a lot of topics in these DVDs, but to me, this is another one of the very fundamental questions that we can ask. In other words, is it really scientific to think that life could just make itself? And maybe another way to phrase the question is it scientific to believe that something happens spontaneously, and of course that's life arising from non-life, that we have been unable to duplicate given our best laboratories, our smartest scientists, and virtually unlimited financial resources? And so when you ask that question, and it's always a good technique, of course, to ask people questions. If I just go up to someone and say, you think life just made itself? That's ridiculous. It goes against everything we know about science. I mean, it does go against everything we know about science, but the person would immediately get on the defensive. But phrased this way, I've asked many professed agnostics, many professed atheists, this question worded in this way: well, is it scientific to believe that? I've yet to have one come back and say it's scientific, because when they think about it, of course, it's not scientific. It has, not really, it goes against everything we know about science, but they know it's not scientific. Now, unfortunately, it's not a case of, they say, well, yeah, you're right, that's not scientific. A lot of times in the conversation we'll end with them saying something like, but that's still what I believe. And so we might think, well, that was kind of didn't really go anywhere. But the whole point is we're working to get people to consider the Bible with an open mind. We're working to, again, really start thinking about the fact that, hey, they're more than just several thousand trillion atoms. And so just getting a person to think about it, even if it's only for 5 seconds, but to the point where they acknowledge that, well, that's a good point. It's not scientific to think that life could just make itself. And that's just their belief. Well, that's actually a start. It's a start to them, maybe eventually being willing to study the Bible with us, or again, approach the Bible with an open mind. And we can go, further than that. When we talk about unlimited financial resources, we've spent hundreds of billions of dollars in biotechnology, have incredibly sophisticated laboratories, very smart people working in that field. No one's come close to making life from non-living matter. And God, of course, has given us the intelligence and the creativity to do some amazing things. We can make cars, we can make airplanes, we can make space shuttles, and they can cost a few $billion depending on how sophisticated we get. But you just think of what God has again given us the intelligence and the creativity to be able to do. We've never come close to making life. And so if someone says, 3.8 billion years ago, life just made itself, that goes against everything we know about science, and it's a purely religious statement. It'd be just like saying, those space shuttles, they just randomly assemble and launch themselves, or airplanes or cars, anything like that. If someone said that, we'd think, well, there'd be something wrong. I mean, we'd throw them out of the science classroom if they were to say that, automobiles, you just have the right kind of weather and lightning and tornadoes and good junkyard that you'll have automobiles popping out. I mean, again, it'd be ridiculous. But we let people say that somehow, or at least pretend that it's scientific, that life could have just made itself. And we'll talk more. Time doesn't matter. Again, incredible. When we think about what actually happens randomly, anything that really happens randomly, I mean, an elementary school science lab, we should be able to just make it happen, just trivial, if something truly happens randomly. And of course, life would not just randomly make itself any more than a car or a space shuttle or an airplane could just make itself. But at the very least, most people will admit that, well, that's not scientific, but that's still what they believe. And of course, what they're really saying is they know the alternative. If life didn't just make itself, well, then God would have had to make life. And so that's they don't want to admit that alternative, or for whatever reason, they don't want to believe the obvious alternative, but that's possibly one reason they're resistant to it, even if they know, again, it's not scientific. Now, I want to talk about some about how ignorance is the friend of the atheist. And I want to be very careful here. Ignorance just means people didn't know. And so I'm going to have three slides talking about Ernst Haeckel. From everything I think anyone has seen or written about him, he was a very intelligent man. He's very educated, very intelligent. It's just in this particular area he was ignorant. Now, he also had some very extreme opinions that we'll talk about later, very racist opinions. But just as far as, was he, I guess what someone would consider intelligent or educated, it'd be hard to argue that he wasn't. But here's a quote. It says, "During late years, we have become acquainted with Monera, organisms which are, in fact, not composed of any organs at all, but consist entirely of shapeless, simple, homogeneous matter. The entire body of one of these Monera during life is nothing more than a shapeless, mobile little lump of mucus or slime consisting of an albuminous combination of carbon. Simpler or more imperfect organisms we cannot possibly conceive." Now, this was in his book, History of Creation, and it was very overtly his version, he's trying to replace the book of Genesis in the Bible. And so one of the things he recognized right away is he has to come up with this idea that there's this really simple life, that it's probably just making itself all over the place. One thing that you want to look at, you look at his literary style, you look at kind of the eloquence of his writing, very, very well-spoken, very good writer from the standpoint of kind of drawing the reader in. I mean, during late years, we have become acquainted. Well, you see that a lot. A lot of the leading atheists, a lot of the individuals that try to lead us and our children and society in general away from Christianity, they're very eloquent. So it's very important that we look at what they're actually saying and what they're actually writing, and not just focus in about, again, how accomplished they are, as a writer or as an orator, because that's an easy way to get deceived. And so, again, this was Ernst Haeckel. He goes on, he says, "The first complete observations on the natural history of a Moneron," and he even has a Latin name for it, "were made by me at Nice in 1864. Other very remarkable Monera I examined later, 1866 in Lanzarote, one of the Canary Islands, and in 1867 in the Straits of Gibraltar. The complete history of one of these Monera, the orange-red Protomixa aurantiaca, is represented in Plate 1, and its explanation is given in the appendix. I found some curious Monera also in the North Sea, off the Norwegian coast near Britain." Now, all of this was wrong, and as we'll show, by 1875, people knew that it was just amorphous gypsum that was being precipitated out. But you just notice how convincing this style is that he's writing in. Goes on and says, talks about perhaps the most remarkable of all Monera was discovered by Huxley, the celebrated English zoologist. Keeps adding more and more and more to this particular case. But in 1875, evidence that observed Monera were lifeless inorganic compounds were available as early as 1875. And that year it was determined that alleged Monera were nothing more than amorphous gypsum precipitated out of seawater by alcohol. However, even with clear refutation from true operational science, Monera continued to be presented as fact for 50 years. Okay, so now you make the transition from ignorance. Because you give Haeckel the benefit of the doubt, he's just ignorant, he didn't know that he was, all he was looking at was amorphous gypsum precipitated out of seawater by alcohol. So give him the benefit of the doubt that he's just ignorant there. But then, and so that, of course, that was the friend of the atheist, this ignorance about life and how complicated it was. We knew nothing about DNA or proteins or the complexity of a cell or anything at all. So that ignorance was the friend of the atheist. But then once they knew that it was wrong, they still kept presenting that somehow as evidence in favor of atheism. And so that, again, goes back to the craftiness and trickery and deceitful scheming. And so that's again just the context again of how this discussion can play out. And so without advances in true science, we would still be believing in Moneron. In other words, we would still believe that these simple cells, they're just inconceivably simple. We would still be believing in that if it wasn't for the advances in true science. And so when we talk about true science is the Christian's friend, that's actually a very good example. Another area where true science is the Christian's friend is related to DNA. Deoxyribonucleic acid, extremely complex molecule used to code for all the physical characteristics of life, consists of building blocks called nucleotides. And so the question then, or one of the immediate questions is, well, can those building blocks, so we learned about DNA, we learned about the building blocks, the nucleotides. Question is, well, could those building blocks somehow just randomly assemble themselves? And so there's a lot of different ways we can look at it. The answer is no. And so I'm going to start out with just one example. This was from a debate back in the mid 1800s about how, well, given infinite time, anything can happen. Be the first example. But then we're also going to talk about just some of the issues that we have with, again, this idea that building blocks could somehow assemble themselves. So this is 1860. Thomas Huxley proposed that given 6 monkeys, 6 typewriters, and unlimited time, the monkeys would eventually type all of the books in the British Library. Okay, so that's really interesting. You think about the visual effect of that analogy. I think when he first said that, people immediately they start picturing these monkeys and these typewriters, and then all the books in the British Library, and so it creates this really exciting visual. Again, it's kind of a little bit of trickery, a little bit of craftiness, because the question is, well, that's again a very just colorful statement. But it doesn't have anything at all to do with the real world. And so if we decide to follow that, again, he's saying 6 monkeys, 6 typewriters, all the books in the British Library. Well, if we start to follow that, let's see how far we could really get with that. And so, of course, by the 6 monkeys and the 6 typewriters, he's just talking about you're just going to have random keys being hit on a typewriter. And so we'll make it easy. Or in other words, we'll favor the evolutionist, we'll favor the atheist, and we'll say, well, just suppose there's only 26 options on the typewriter keyboard. In other words, there's no capitalization, no lowercase, no uppercase, no commas, semicolons, nothing like that. Just 26 basic letters, and we're just going to start randomly hitting keys on that typewriter. Well, what would be the odds of hitting a W? Oh, think about, okay, you had 26 options, and just totally random. Well, the odds of hitting a W on that keyboard, well, that's going to be 1 in 26, right? You had 26 keys, you hit a W, that's 1 in 26. What would then be the odds of hitting a W followed by an E? Well, the odds of hitting the W was 1 in 26. The odds of hitting an E was also 1 in 26. So the odds of hitting a W followed by an E, it's 1 in 26 times 1 in 26, or 1 in 676. Now, if we wanted to hit W-E-A-R-E, okay, so no spaces, no points, but it's just we are. Okay, so we want to hit W-E-A-R-E. Well, now all of a sudden you have 1 in 26 of the W, 1 in 26 of the E, 1 in 26 of the A, 1 in 26 of the R, 1 in 26 of the other E. So now the odds are getting pretty low. You're looking at 1 in 11,881,376. So that's starting to be, well, it's kind of unlikely. And that's just typing we are. We're not getting too close to all the books in the British Library yet. I want to type we are a bunch of monkeys. Okay, now you're all of a sudden you're in 1 in 1.99 times 10 to the 20. So really, really, really unlikely at that point. Now, if we want to type we are a bunch of monkeys trying to type something that makes sense, that's not working yet, but maybe given infinite time, now you're looking at 1 in 6.89 times 10 to the 135th. In other words, that's 6.89 divided by 1 followed by 135 zeros. Well, that's not going to happen. A lot of ways we can say that, but just using the evolutionists' own dating, using their own timeline, 20 billion years, that's 6.3 times 10 to the 23rd millionths of a second. In other words, that number is just tiny compared to the odds of randomly typing that last phrase that we mentioned. Number of atoms in the universe, less than 10 to the 80th. And so even though, again, we had this very colorful statement, kind of entertaining statement from Huxley, nothing to do with the real world at all. In other words, there is absolutely no way 6 monkeys and 6 typewriters are going to type all of the books in the British Library in the real world. And so, again, but again, I usually say, like, that's how the discussion is often couched, or how this particular false religion of atheism is often pushed, is again by things like this, and that's just showing again what 1 in 6.89 times 10 to the 135th would look like. Now, there's also, I guess you'd say more. If we want to get into really the true science, we know why. Many reasons why DNA or protein, couldn't, possibly make itself. This is just a list of a few of them. First of all, and this is proteins, but it's true for the building blocks of RNA and DNA as well. With proteins, if we put, say, amino acids in water, only 1 in 100, say a lot of amino acids in a bucket of water, only 1 in 100 are going to be actually bonded in a string of 2 amino acids. 1 in 10,000 would be 3, and only 1 out of 1 followed by 140 zeros would be 70 amino acids all strung together, and that's the smallest protein. So just from the standpoint of, well, would a protein even form randomly? Well, that's just getting that many amino acids to stay together in a watery environment. And so, and again, with the idea that somehow, some warm little pond or somewhere life formed, well, you can rule that out right away, because again, those odds just don't happen. Now also, the building blocks of proteins, amino acids, building blocks of DNA, the building blocks of RNA, well, they occur in what they call left-handed and right-handed forms, and there's a lot of good literature on the Apologetics Press website about that. But again, you have these left-handed and right-handed forms, but they all have to be one-handed to when they form these more complex molecules. In other words, all of the proteins, all the amino acids in a protein are left-handed. The building blocks and nucleotides and RNA and DNA, they're all right-handed. And so again, but you get this, if things were just random, you actually get this even mix, and they react equivalently. And so again, that rules out any chance of these molecules forming. Now, people will sometimes say, oh yeah, but we did an experiment, and this experiment is starting to fall out of favor. But for many decades, people would point to this Miller-Urey experiment, and they would say, oh, well, that showed that the building blocks of life could somehow form. And so that was actually in textbooks. If you go back to a textbook written in, say, the 70s or 80s, boy, it's all about the Miller-Urey experiment, showing these building blocks would form. But what was discouraging is it would talk about the experiment, but it wouldn't mention all of the factors in the experiment that showed it was essentially irrelevant, for the formation of life. The produced only small amounts of amino acids, about 2% of the product, and those amino acids had to be removed to keep them from being destroyed by the way the experiment was set up. It also produced tar, which was 85% of the product, carboxylic acid, which was 13% of the product, and of course those poison enzymes in living systems, which would result in death. They had a proposed atmosphere, highly contrived atmosphere, that now people are saying probably never existed. In the mid-90s, NASA sent a probe to Jupiter, the Galileo probe, and there were actually some scientists, I believe, I think Carl Sagan, was even, before that probe, but he was even saying that that when we went to Jupiter, we might find things flying around in the Jovian atmosphere. In other words, to them, it was the perfect place for life to evolve. We found no complex molecules whatsoever. We found, I think, C2H6. Again, just a simple, it could be called a complex organic molecule. It's a very simple molecule, but technically, but again, nowhere close to life, nowhere close to anything showing that life was evolving on Jupiter. And so that's so again, we had that refutation, that showing that particular idea had no predictive power. In other words, it wasn't we couldn't predict. We predicted, or some people predicted that, well, we're going to find these molecules here, and we didn't. Found really what was expected from chemistry, just only very relatively simple molecules. Numerous experiments analogous to Miller-Urey have been contrived, all failed to show any credible mechanism for protein formation. And then also, every now and then people write a computer program, and they'll say, oh, this computer program somehow shows that these molecules will form, but they're always seeking predetermined results. And so those types of computer programs, they aren't at all analogous to the spontaneous formation of life, or even of these proteins or DNA or RNA chains. And so I don't know how else to phrase it. Again, it's the trickery, the craftiness, the deceitfulness. Evolutionists know this. Atheists know this, and they bury it. And so it's just, again, how the conversation is couched. Now I do want to say, a lot of times people will parrot these types of arguments. They'll parrot the discussion. They're not, as an individual, being deceitful or showing trickery or craftiness. They're just parroting what they've heard. But at some level, this whole construct, this whole religion of atheism is based on that. It's, again, goes against everything we know about true science. And so to sell that particular idea, they have to resort to other things as described in Ephesians 4:14 and 15. Now, a lot of scientists do go ahead and they acknowledge what's going on, but this is where it's also very important that we follow on with the conversation, that again, we speak the truth in love, and then we encourage the person to study the Bible, to objectively consider the Bible. This is a quote from Sir Frederick Hoyle. It says, "The likelihood of the formation of life from inanimate matter is 1 to a number with 40,000 knots after it. It is enough to bury Darwin and the whole theory of evolution. There is no primeval soup, neither on this planet nor on any other, and if the beginnings of life were not random, they must therefore have been produced, the product of purposeful intelligence." And so, when he said that, a lot of people thought, wow, he's become a Christian, or he's starting to believe in God, because again, one and one followed by 40,000 zeros. And he was just talking about the proteins in an amoeba. And so if someone looks at that number, again, one and one followed by 40,000 zeros, well, that's impossible. By any definition of impossibility, that's just not going to happen. And so when he said that, the obvious conclusion is, well, he must be ready to put his faith in God. He must be talking about God. Well, unfortunately, what he had essentially done, and by the way, Fred Hoyle, he coined the term Big Bang. So he essentially named the Big Bang. He's a very famous British astronomer, but he didn't want to put his faith in God. And to my knowledge, no one knows why he didn't want to put his faith in God. But he knew evolution couldn't work. And so he came up with a theory, an idea. He called it directed panspermia. And the idea of directed panspermia is that, well, don't want to believe in God, and evolution doesn't work, but life had to get here somewhere. And so what his theory is, well, aliens must have put us here. And he literally wrote 3 books on the subject. And so again, don't want to believe in God, knows evolution can't work, and so we got here somehow, so well, obviously aliens put us here. And again, talking about a very intelligent person, but just think about that. That doesn't answer the fundamental question. In other words, okay, aliens put us here, well then where'd the aliens come from? Very obvious question, very easy question. Didn't address it. And so again, it's just the need not just to present this type of evidence, present the idea that true science is the Christian's friend, the enemy of the evolutionist. It's have to take the person to the next step. In other words, have to get them to objectively consider the Bible, because Fred Hoyle's rejection of evolution did him no good, because he never put his faith in God. He never obeyed the gospel. And then finally, I think it's always important to point out, the Bible is very clear what we need to do to be saved. The Bible is very clear about God's plan of salvation. Romans 1:16, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek." And then, of course, there's numerous examples in the Bible of people being saved that we can point people to, and that we can, again, show them, let them read for themselves what the Bible says. I know a lot of people, they'll say that when they became Christians, they would try many denominations, and it was finally when then they would say, well, what's your opinion of this, or what do you think about that? It's when the individual studying with them said, well, it doesn't matter, what I think. It doesn't matter what our congregation thinks. Let's see what the Bible says, and take them to the Bible, and again, let them read the Bible for themselves, and then it'll become very clear to them what they need to do to be saved. Thank you.